This whiskey is our flagship whiskey. It's our 36 Texas Straight Bourbon whiskey. So there's 5 things primarily that make bourbon bourbon. The first, it's a product of the U.S. So in 1964, Congress declared bourbon a distinctive spirit and product of the United States. So it's just like tequila is a product of Mexico, Scotch is a product of Scotland. It can be made in any state in the U.S. to include the great state of Texas. The second thing that makes bourbon bourbon is it has to be made from at least 51% corn. Now most bourbons are about 70% corn on average. Also 16% in grain bills, either rye or wheat. We use rye, gives it a little bit more spicy character. And we use 14% barley in a grain bill, but think 51% at least, but on average about 70% corn. The third thing that makes bourbon bourbon has to be aged in a brand new charred oak barrel every time. So when it goes in the barrel, it's completely clear. That means it picks up 100% of its color and about 70% of its flavor from the barrel itself. So when it gets hot, like it does here in South Texas, the liquid expands, goes through this char layer and into the wood. When it cools down at nighttime in other parts of the year, it contracts back. So think about this accordion effect where the whiskey's going in and out, in and out, in and out. At the same time, it's pulling flavors out of the wood. The alcohol is breaking down all these natural sugars to give the character of bourbon that we want. The fourth thing that makes bourbon bourbon, it has to come off of our still at 160 proof or less. And that's because whiskey is all about the flavor of the grain and the yeast. So unlike vodka where we're going to strip all the character out of it, we got to distill it at a lower proof to keep that flavor in. And the last thing that makes bourbon bourbon is it has to go in this barrel at 125 proof or less. And that's because we want the right concentration of alcohol to water to make sure that we get the right breakdown inside this barrel over the course of sometimes years. So let's get into drinking the whiskey. When we do a whiskey evaluation, and we recommend this with any new bottle of whiskey that you get, we like to do a 4-step evaluation. The first we do is appearance. So if you guys want to hold it up to the light, give it a look. Now again, because bourbon's aged in that brand new charred oak barrel, it's going to pick up these deeper, richer tones to it. What you can also do is swirl it around the side of the glass, and you can see those streaks come down the side, so the legs. Now that's something to do with the surface tension between the alcohol and the water. You can actually determine the proof of the whiskey by the width of those legs, but we won't get into that here. The second thing we're going to do is aroma. So what we recommend you do is so you get the actual aroma of the whiskey without the burn is to put it under your nose and inhale through your mouth. So let's go ahead and try that now. So typically what we do, there's all kinds of different flavors you can get from whiskey, but for the bourbon, we're going to break it down into primarily 3 buckets. The first is sweet. So think about all those sweet notes, caramel, brown sugar, vanilla, all those natural sugars we talked about from the barrel. You may even pick up a little bit of honey that comes in there. The second is spice. So you might pick up nutmeg, black pepper, maybe a little bit of cinnamon. Some of that comes from the rye, some of it's from the barrel itself. And the last bucket is oak. So think about it. Is it toasted? Is it like fresh cut oak? Is it charred? How charred is it? These are the ways that you're going to describe whiskey as you go through this. Now on this one, the aroma, what you're picking up out of our bourbon is probably some of the sweeter notes, some of the vanilla on the front end, maybe a little bit of caramel, and maybe some of the spice as well. The oak's definitely going to be present. That's a characteristic of Texas bourbon just because of the heat that we have here. The third thing we're going to do is taste and finish. Now, you don't want to drink all this at one time. So what we want to do is take the first sip, let it acclimate our taste buds to the spirit. So if we think about how we were probably conditioned early on to drink whiskey, it was what? Shoot it, chase it, move on with our lives. But what we want to do is actually taste this whiskey. And because sometimes we're out, maybe you've had a beer and you've got hop oils on your tongue, you're eating food, and it's kind of concealing the taste of the whiskey on that first sip. So what I want you guys to do, let's take that first sip and see what you might be tasting. So let it kind of wash over your entire palate. So some of those flavors that we talked about in the aroma, you might be getting some of the sweet, maybe some of the spice, maybe some of the oak. Think about how it also moves from the front to the back of the palate, and maybe how those flavors might change. So you might get sweet on the front end, and maybe it might turn into spice or wood more on the back end. Now what you want to do is give this a little bit of time. This bourbon in particular at 96 proof tends to have a pretty long finish. So it's usually going on a little bit more in your mouth as it's diluting down, and perhaps some of those flavors are changing a little bit. Now, once you've given it a little bit of time, what you want to do is go ahead and take that second sip, but this time, think about those flavors you got both from the aroma and that first sip and see how it might have matured or evolved for you from that first to the second sip on the palate. So if you haven't done so already, let's go ahead and take the second sip and see what you guys are tasting. So immediately, what most people get, it seems a lot smoother on that second sip. And that's because your taste buds in your mouth have already now been acclimated to the alcohol itself. Now you're also going to pick up different things. So sometimes people might pick up, a little bit more spice, maybe a little bit of sweetness, maybe a little bit more oak. Now, I usually say there's no wrong answer with what you taste here unless you tell me you're tasting asparagus or Brussels sprouts, and that's completely wrong. But what you're going to get is the whiskey evolving just a little bit within there. So this is what we recommend. Try it neat first, just like we just did. However, what you also can do, if you have an eyedropper of water, you can put a couple drops in there. That's going to dilute it. It's going to change the character a little bit. If you don't have a fancy eyedropper, you can just use a simple straw, dip it in, and put some water in. Other things you can do are ice cubes inside. That's going to cool it down without diluting it, change the character a little bit. They also make whiskey stones, so you can throw these in the freezer or the fridge. They're going to cool it down without diluting it, and thus it's not going to change the flavor as much. But pretty much what you want to do is drink the whiskey how you like it. Experiment with it. What we recommend, if you're going to mix it with something that highlights the flavor of the whiskey. Classic cocktails like Manhattans and Old Fashions work extremely well with this whiskey. But this is our flagship, our 36 Texas Straight Bourbon Whiskey.